Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeongmin Kim. I'm editorial director of Korea Pro, and I will be your moderator for tonight. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Seoul Circuit event. This is the first Seoul Circuit of the year, so Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. 새해 복 많이 받으세요. Was that okay?
Yes. Today's topic is Rethinking Korea Beyond the Washington Consensus. And thank you, Mason and Chad, for joining us today as speakers. Korea Pro is an intelligence service, analysis service that covers all sorts of South Korea things, South Korean politics, geopolitics, economy, society, and recently a lot of martial law coverages. If you haven't checked it out and if you're not a subscriber, please visit koreapro.org to read our latest analysis, including Chad's one of his pieces that covered this exact topic right after the martial law declaration. Today's Seoul Circuit will be recorded for a podcast episode only for the moderated discussion part, but the Q&A part will be exclusively Chatham House rule per usual, so feel free to ask questions as frankly as possible. Seoul Circuit is different from our usual breakfast briefings. Breakfast briefings, we tend to be doing the usual formal stuff at the hotels and, breakfasts and formal topics, but we thought sometimes we need somewhere quirky like this place today, over drinks and Chatham House rule, secret chats basically, a little bit, so that we can be as frank as possible when it's needed, like today's discussion topic. So, right into the topic. Remember that time when people in DC thought that it's such a great idea to let President Yoon Suk-yeol host the Summit for Democracy? Good old times. I bring this up because that's related to today's topic. Today we're going to be discussing the challenges and limitations of mainstream Washington blob, quote-unquote, analysis of the Korean Peninsula, and we will be examining how the institutional biases, geographic distances, and languages sometimes, and groupthink, echo chamber sort of phenomena shape analysis and what details are missed when you're only listening to the blob interpretation of things. And I'll be asking a lot of devil's advocate questions as well. Let's kick off with what you wrote, actually, Chad, recently. What was your main hypothesis when you brought up the idea of the problems with the beltway thinking?
Thank you, Jeongmin. So, for those of you who don't know about when the martial law was imposed, about what was it, a month?
December 3rd.
December 3rd. I was tracking what people in DC were saying about the topic because many years ago, 2010. Till 2013, I worked in DC in the think tank community. I worked for a number of think tanks, one in particular focused on South Korea. And that was a very instructive period of my professional experience because I saw firsthand the influence of the Korean government funding on what we say and don't say. And to give you an example, there was one time I was publishing a piece on our blog, and on Monday, the blog had disappeared. And my boss said that he'd got a call from the Blue House. This was Park Geun-hye era. They didn't like what I'd said.
What did you say?
Oh, it was pretty mundane. It was. I wish it was something sexier, but it was actually pretty shit. It was nothing special.
This is being recorded for the podcast.
Yeah, and my former employer may be listening as well. Hello. So I was aware of, there's an impact from Korean government funding. So after the martial law, I took a look at what people in DC from the key think tanks are saying and not saying. And I noticed a few things that stood out to me. Firstly was think tanks that have strong takes on North Korea and provide very vivid adjectives for describing what a despot Kim Jong-un is. I don't know if some of the journalists noticed it. They suddenly went into journalist mode and were just like putting out fact sheets. This is what happened. Here's the timeline, but no actual analysis or perspective on it. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I noticed that those going on TV were talking a lot about how that this imposition of martial law is really demonstrating how great South Korea's democratic system is, because very quickly the National Assembly voted it down, and you know the rest of history. And that was a key talking point for several talking heads. The other thing I noticed was that, in a nutshell, those were the two key things I noticed. And the place I used to work at, Korea Economic Institute, which is funded exclusively by the Korean government, said absolutely nothing on the issue for a long time. And I thought, this is their bread and butter subject. It's to share informed analysis about what's going on in South Korea, and you don't say anything. If you look at their blog in the last few weeks, I looked at it last night, there are just an assortment of topics that are really not at the top of anyone's search strings right now online. That's in a nutshell what it was about. And I got a phone call, I got some negative feedback from people I'd named and mentioned in the article. Hello, if you're listening. But it was a constructive dialogue, and we shared different perspectives, which we can talk about.
Thank you, Chad. While we are on that, let's stay on this case for just a little bit more, and then move on to more general, broader questions. Mason, remember a lot of DC experts talking about democratic backslide back in the day during the Moon Jae-in administration, especially. There were some people who were comparing the expert talks at the time and then the muted response in DC overall after the martial law declaration. Do you think, what's the main difference here basically, or are we cherry picking what we are seeing right now?
Sorry, who's we?
Oh, me. Am I cherry picking,
Okay.
thinking that they are being muted basically?
Okay. So first of all, I just want to start by saying thank you for the invitation to be here, and also thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm going to answer your question directly, but then I want to put a little bit of, let's say, background to what I think about DC generally, and maybe how that question fits into it.
Sure.
And also maybe that's going to describe a little bit my role being here today. I do think that there is a little bit of a cherry picking issue, in the sense that this particular martial law event was really hard to predict in advance. And that's sort of the apotheosis of the democratic backsliding that we've been seeing in Korea for the last, let's say, 8 years. And as easy as it is to hit DC for groupthink, as easy as it is to hit DC for, let's say, putting their thumb on the scales in terms of how it is that they look at the two parties here sometimes, the fact of the matter is, I don't know a single person here in Seoul who predicted this either. There was one DP lawmaker who brought it up in a public confirmation hearing, who no one took seriously, myself included. And so I think the first thing I would say is the Koreas are hard, both south and north, and not just for people in DC, but also for people who have been here, even people who have been here a long time. There are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes here that are very difficult to get access to if you're not Korean. And that's true whether or not you're in the US or whether or not you're here or anywhere else. So I think that the Koreas are a hard target, and of course North Korea is an even harder target for all of the reasons that everyone here knows. So that's the direct answer to your question. I think the broader thing that I would like to say about DC, and I can't believe I'm saying this, is that the think tank community and the DC blob actually gets a lot of Korea pretty right. And it's not that I'm enthusiastic about defending the think tank community in DC, and as we'll come to a little bit later, I think I have plenty of criticisms which I will pull out. But part of my job here is a little bit to be the foil to Chad, who's going to take a bit of a more critical line. And I think I would simply say, if you look at some of the things that they do, such as CSIS is beyond parallel, right? The open source intelligence that they do on North Korea's missile launches, or the satellite imagery that they find on naval bases and things like that. Same thing with the Stimson Center in 38 North. And of course, speaking of money, the reason why 38 North is now where it is now is because of South Korea's government got involved in the work that they were doing. So it's not like I'm denying the role that the South Korean government plays in meddling in the way that the US perceives South Korea. You have various think tanks who put together military power indices on North Korea and South Korea and China and Taiwan and Japan, and they put them in a comparative context. I think that open source intelligence that comes out of the DC think tank world is actually a really valuable resource. It's valuable for your work, my guess is. It's valuable for my work. And I think that they get a lot of that stuff right. I would also say that, for better or for worse, and some of both, I think that the DC think tank world also holds quite a bit of institutional knowledge about US-Korea relations. And I think that institutional knowledge is valuable, right? It is sometimes biased. It certainly sometimes slants one way more than another, but I also think it's kind of important. Put very sort of explicitly, I would say the think tanks in Washington, the people who work for them, that is indeed a sometimes dysfunctional world. It's oftentimes a cynical world, as DC is, right? The cynicism in DC is off the charts, right? If you haven't ever spent any time in DC, maybe you're not aware of that, but the cynicism is absolutely off the charts. And that is a part of what happens in think tanks too. And I think where Washington gets most in trouble, and that's what comes back to the martial law thing, is when the DC think tank community starts talking about values. And that's where the cynicism plays a role, right? And so I'm not just disappointed in how the think tanks have responded to the martial law declaration here and the aftermath. I'm also disappointed in how the US government responded to that as well, right? Kurt Campbell made a statement a few days after December 3rd, which was more or less a significant statement. And then everything else that you heard prior to December 3rd and then up until the recent statement by Sullivan where he called it shocking and wrong was essentially the same stuff that you always hear from the US government. Ironclad this and stable that and ironclad this, and it was ad nauseum. That's disappointing, right? Now, I'm cynical enough to not be surprised, but it's still a problem, I would say, for a number of different reasons. But the think tanks, they're a part of that same ecosystem, which I'll come back to. So they get in trouble when they start talking about values, and that's where I think you ding them this time, not incorrectly, but I think you have to put that in the larger context. And essentially what I'd say is if you didn't have the DC think tank world, you would still have to invent it, right? The same thing that we kind of say about the UN or the Security Council, right? Yes, it may be dysfunctional, but you still kind of need it, and you would kind of have to invent it even if it didn't exist. So I think I'll sort of stop there for my first round of answers.
Thank you. Thanks for the context and pushing back on chat a little bit. I think you guys are seeing putting weight on different aspects of what the responsibilities and roles of the think tanks might be, like between you and Chad and Mason. But last question on the martial law case. It's an if question. Could more candid criticism from the US government or the think tanks when they saw relevant signs before the martial law declaration, would it have helped change something? Consequences?
Probably not. I think we know enough about Yoon that he was in his own world watching YouTube, and I don't think he really cared that much. Can I just respond to one
Sure.
thing though? So I think Mason made some fair points, but I would counter by saying when you look at what think tanks are doing, yes, there's a lot of open source analysis, and I would say that there's a safe bucket of topics for pretty impartial, objective work. North Korea, pretty much any part. Where it all starts to fall apart is when think tanks have to talk about South Korea. And the key reason is the funding for the think tanks in DC, predominantly when it comes to Korea, comes from the South Korean government. Now, it can come in multiple forms. It can come from the embassy directly in DC. It can come through the Korea Foundation. It can come through all manner of state think tanks in Korea, the Ministry of Unification. And don't think that this is without strings. I think it's, the think tankers in DC will tell you that they're completely free to say whatever they want. That might be true, but the consequences of saying whatever they want are equally true. And I'll just give you one example. Nicholas Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute in 2005, when there was growing anti-US sentiment in South Korea, argued that it was high time well, the AEI publication, In-House Magazine, argued it was time for the US to reconsider its alliance with South Korea. Korea Foundation cut its funding for American Enterprise Institute very shortly after that. I think gives a very vivid example of where the guardrails are of what's safe and not safe to say. And so I agree, there's lots of great work being done on Korea, we shouldn't exclude it, but the disappointment for me, and this is not specific to Korea, Qatar is throwing money. A lot of Middle Eastern countries are throwing money into what is said in DC, and it does have huge impacts on other topics. The UK is one of the biggest funders of think tanks in DC. Anyway, I'll stop there. There's a lot I want to talk about on this though.
Mason, do you want to add anything or refute anything about the funding issue? How much of that funding actually impacts the work of a think tank, and is it necessarily a bad thing?
Okay, so that's a complicated question. Yes, of course. It affects what the think tanks do, obviously, and maybe I'll come back to that in more depth at a different point. I think in many respects I'm largely in agreement with Chad, and on the money it plays a role. There's no doubt about it. The think tanks might deny it, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. I would just say, not to be sympathetic, so to speak, but just to provide a little bit of context. For those of you who don't know, many think tanks in the United States work on a model for their research fellows that we call "eat what you kill," which means that their salaries are paid in significant part by their own fundraising. And so, if you're a research fellow, you're not only in some cases paying for some of the things that you want to do in terms of programming, but you're also paying a part of your salary. The think tank may pay part of it, but part of your salary is coming from the money that you raise. So you have a strong incentive to look where the money is. And that actually grows somewhat the more that you move up the pecking order in the think tank world, where if you're a sort of like senior program fellow, you're perhaps raising some of your own salary. Probably you are a little bit. You're definitely raising some programming money, but you're also raising money for some of the people below you, right? Some of the people that you have for research fellows and interns and things like that. And you're probably going to be asked also to raise money that you kick up a little bit also to the senior executives for the things that they want to do think tank wide, right? So that's a really tough position to be in. And if you take a look, I won't name any names, but if you take a look at some of the people in Washington, D.C. who have changed some of their positions in think tanks, frequently it's when they've been able to go from a position that had that type of pressure on them to one where they were in a chair or an endowed position where they didn't have to do as much fundraising. They still have to do some, everybody has to raise some, but they don't have to do as much. It's a huge burden on them. And so to some degree, you're just gonna have to look where the money is. And where's the money? And the money is oftentimes in the security and defense sector. And so you end up securitizing a lot of issues simply because those are the interests of the funders in one way or another. It happens to also be the case that security and defense is a big issue here on the peninsula because of the alliance, so there's a sort of natural alignment that happens there. But I think that there are some structural reasons and some I guess you would say nitty-gritty reasons in terms of the incentives that people have on a very personal human level to work the way that they do in DC. If I can just add then a second part, which isn't so much pushing back against Chad, but perhaps just, again, trying to make the picture a little bit larger. Your point is they frequently get South Korea wrong, right? That like maybe the North Korea bucket is pretty safe, or like certain elements of foreign policy is pretty safe, but like their analysis of Korea maybe goes off the rails sometimes.
Or it overlooks. It overlooks, it doesn't swerve certain topics.
Sure, overlooks certain things. That's, again, probably fair. But I think that to some degree that ignores the fact, or let's say puts an emphasis on something that isn't per se perhaps the role of the think tank. And I know that's going to sound perhaps surprising. And you'll say, well, of course, the job of the think tank people who are working on the Koreas is to get Korea right. But I would make the argument that the blob in general and think tanks specifically function very well at their main task. And their main task is actually occupying a place in the DC government ecosystem. Basically, think tanks and that blob think tank world and the government cross-fertilize each other. And that happens, I think, in at least three ways. The first of which is that think tanks function as a revolving door into and out of government, right? You would be surprised, I think, how many people go into government because they're in the right think tank and are working with a former person who used to be in government, and how many people who are currently in government now are going to end up in think tank sinecures until their time comes, the next time that their party comes into power. So that's the first part of it. And that means that there's a sort of thought process that's shared between the government and the think tanks, right? And that explains in part the groupthink. The second thing is, in principle, we sort of imagine think tanks as being a place where ideas are formed, right? That's where you have the researchers there who, gather the data and get the information and analyze it. The economists with their statistical models and the international relations people with their international relations theories and, et cetera, and that they try to influence or upload those ideas into government. That's actually a very, very small part of what think tanks do. What think tanks mostly do is actually download ideas from government and then put a veneer of research on top of them. They're essentially partially there to sell government policy. And so in that sense, you have to remember the job of the United States government is not to understand South Korea. The job of the United States government is to advance perceived US interests. And to the extent that think tanks are connected with that way of thinking, that's what think tanks do also.
Well, I want to say, so a good example recently, some of the diplomats in the room will have an idea about this. Korean government, not so long ago, a few months ago, was pushing this whole G7 membership thing, right? It's a very specific thing to push. We started seeing some high-profile people in DC advocating for G7 membership in columns and op-eds. And I'm thinking, how has this idea come into the think tank world? And now if you've got people in DC who are basically echoing ideas from South Korea that we know from the diplomatic community were being aggressively pushed at the time, then is that in US government interest to promote that? It seems to me that's effectively South Korean talking points being made organic and allowed to bubble up and pressure the US on something that probably isn't in Washington's interest.
So the key word for me when we talk about national interest is the word perceived, right? Perceived national interest. I'm not saying objectively whether or not what the think tank world or even what the U.S. government does vis-a-vis South Korea or any other country actually advances the U.S. interest. My God, I mean, look at what, I'm a U.S. citizen, so I can say we. Look at what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? That hardly advanced our national interest, and yet we, told ourselves that it did for years and years, right? So the word perceived, or the idea of perception and what your interests are, makes a huge difference here. And yeah, I think that both Washington, in the sort of, post-Trump rising China, U.S.-China rivalry world, in which we see the rules-based international order. Don't snicker, you snickered. The rules-based international order, the liberal world order, et cetera, that world which was being challenged or contested, I think the United States thought could be propped up or altered in such a way that it would gain new momentum, it would gain new life through perhaps considering some type of expansion of key pillars of that. And I don't think that there was necessarily a lot of real U.S. government interest in expanding G7. Obviously, South Korea wanted it, but the United States was sort of willing to listen to the pitch, both from a government level and also on a think tank level, even if everyone knew that it was a pretty far-fetched project in the first place. So I think that the perception of interest, more so than the actual objective interest itself, or what's at play here. And the United States and South Korea are allies, and so the United States is willing to take some ideas from South Korea that it wouldn't entertain from others, and that filters down, as I said, filters down to the think tank community. And that, of course, it also comes from South Korea itself. Again, that's where the money part comes in. I mean, obviously, there are certain South Korean entities that would like to push the idea of South Korea being in the G7. And if you're trying in a think tank to raise money to talk about some diplomatic initiative that South Korea doesn't find interesting, and you won't get money for it, and then you start finding a way to shoehorn in the idea of expanding the G7 to a G8 or G9 or whatever else, all of a sudden you look like you might have some more money coming your way. So the errors of the think tank community in the U.S. are overdetermined, right? There are lots of different ways that you can get Korea wrong, or that you can perhaps confound your interest with South Korea's interest. But all of them ultimately have, in some form or another, rational reasons, I think, and all of them in some ways also, come back to the fact that ultimately the think tanks and the U.S. government are not nearly as separate as one might think. In fact, they're cross-fertilizing.
Right, if we explain it like that in the context of, the relationship between, overlapping people like former officials going into think tanks and whatnot, it's like easier to understand. But that for ordinary people who read what the think tanks publish and the experts, TV interviews and the op-eds and whatnot, isn't it sometimes problematic that it's difficult to figure out how much was like foreign influence or the government influence or whatnot? Just
Sorry.
wait, Chad. Boss. Let me give you a case. Sumi Terry recently got into trouble, all sorts of trouble, really. But one of the things that got noted in the indictment was her column about praising Yoon as someone who was very brave for improving Japan-South Korea relations. So South Korean citizens all of a sudden started doubting the integrity of think tanks and whatnot, and how much do we trust when think tank experts or just blob experts talk about certain issues and say this is good for national interest for your country, like what do we believe or not? Isn't that problematic if it's difficult for ordinary people to figure out?
Yeah. Sorry for getting so excited to grab the microphone from you there, Jeongmin. The reason is because it kind of triggered an analogy, metaphor, I forget, sorry, long day, in my mind. We're all consumers, right? So if we go online and we need to find a new internet service provider, we've just moved into a new house, you Google, what are your options, right? And those of you who know a bit about the internet will probably know that your first page of Google results, there will be a combination of sponsored results, and secondarily, there will be a lot of websites that look like independent review websites, which are actually owned by the internet service providers and give you a very false impression of, the same with VPNs. Now, what you're saying is basically what is going on in DC. And there is a lot of organic ideas being there's an illusion of organic, carefully constructed PhD thinking on the Koreas, which is meant to be impartial, neutral advice for people to take or leave. And the reality is a lot of it is coming from organizations that are heavily funded by the government with a key interest. Now, Korea is number 11 in the Quincy Institute's recent think tank finance tracker. Now that, you might say, it's just number 11, but think about how small Korea is as a country in US Foreign Policy Institute interest, and think about how few people actually work on Korea in DC in the think tank community. I mean, there's probably like 5 to 10 big players, right? So that's in the money they were able to track, that's the 11th most funding going to this issue, and I think that is deeply problematic. I think we are in dire need of independent, creative ideas on this topic. I mean, the status quo of the last 70 plus years is showing that nothing is working with the existing policies. And when you've got people motivated to just serve up the same crap, advocating for ironclad alliance, advocating for containment and sanctions on North Korea, boy, has that worked well. I just feel like ultimately the US taxpayer is the one that's getting ripped off here, because they're paying for policies that don't work, and they're paying for people to justify them over and over again. Now, I know that there are people that are, more impartial than others, and I'm not saying that this is just a DC problem. Pretty much all think tanks have these kind of issues to some extent on multiple countries, but I just think we need more sunshine on where the money is coming from for these think tanks. There should be clarity when you like the calories you see on the food you eat. You should know this is coming from an organization that is 95% funded by South Korea's embassy or ministry X or Y. And then as the consumer, you can say, okay, I can understand and I can take that into consideration. I can take it or leave it. But right now, a lot of this is just going on in the dark. There's no mandatory obligation for think tanks to publish where their funding is coming from. Some are doing it really quite transparently. Others are doing it very untransparently. And what came out of the Sumi Terry case was this revelation that some National Intelligence Service, spy service money is being laundered through think tanks. They talked openly in the indictment about this. And that means that there are think tanks that are playing a role in supporting very specific goals from the South Korean government, seemingly through a lens that is clean. So I think it's very, very problematic.
So you're saying it's not that money is necessarily a problem or an evil at all, but just be transparent is what you're saying.
I think it is, yeah, I think be transparent, number one, but I do think it is problematic, but at least let people decide.
Okay. Mason, any comment?
I'm in violent agreement that we need more and more universal transparency on funding in think tanks. The second thing I would say, to sort of the first way that you put the question, like, how should people approach this, is, just develop, if you don't already have one, a tremendous bullshit detector. And you should essentially assume, I think, that anything that you read coming out of a think tank is going to have an agenda behind it. And your job reading that is to figure out what that agenda is and, to some degree, if possible, who's behind it. And that's obviously where the money part plays a role, but I'd bet 90% of the time it's some amalgam of a creative way that a think tanker wants to dress up policies that he or she thinks are incrementally feasible as a way of advancing the U.S. national interest, because that's what he or she understands from the meetings that he or she is at in Washington, D.C., or when they come do the trips over here, where I will note, by the way, frequently it's quite easy to figure out who's paying for stuff because it's there on the banner, right? Paid for by the Ministry of whatever. So, I think developing a good bullshit detector and asking for more transparency is a totally reasonable thing to ask. And the one thing I would push back on more strongly is, I think you would admit this ultimately, that you're overselling a little bit that nothing has worked for the last 70 years. I mean, we're sitting in a fancy cafe, drinking wine and beer and eating mortadella sandwiches because South Korea has grown from a poverty-ravaged post-war country in 1953 to the fabulously wealthy country that it is today. And say what you will about the United States' many problems, and it does have many, and as a U.S. citizen, I'm acutely aware of them, and happy that I live in Korea precisely because I thought I could escape many of them. But the United States, I think, has also been a major winner from the alliance here. And whether that be, to what degree that's tarnished by the fact that no one seems to be able in DC or anywhere else to figure out what to do with North Korea's nuclear program, or whether that be the stain on the U.S. from supporting Chun Doo-hwan and Park Chung-hee, and the lukewarm response to Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration and the self-coup that was sort of meant to be built on it. Those things are obviously not great, and to use an overused term, they're unacceptable. But I don't think that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the alliance and the peninsula, at least the southern part of it, are better off for what's happened here over the last 70 years.
Yes and no. I think the problem is when people do have new ideas or they're trying to do something different outside of the kind of orthodoxy. I mean, I was in dinners in DC a couple of years ago, just at the tail end of the Moon Jae-in government, and people were saying, "Is that guy a communist? Like he was involved in the student protests. He there's just crazy perceptions by many in DC about the DP writ large in this country. And you'll note that when these talking heads come to Korea, they have much better relationships with conservatives than liberal progressive administrations. That's partly as a function of language. Well-educated conservatives who have lived overseas often speak better English. There's better access as a result. But it's just, even at that level, that there's I find an unnecessary and unhelpful opprobrium to ideas like, let's end the Korean War. Granted, maybe the timing was a little bit off, but why is that really a bad thing? And there was actually a real push against that from some very extremely conservative people, public intellectuals in DC at the time around that. And I just would ask, what has been the result of walking away from that diplomacy in 2018 when it comes to North Korea's nuclear program, human rights? Everything has got worse, I think, it's clear. And yes, we're sitting here eating mortadella hams, but people in the north are not. They're really struggling. Their conditions are getting worse and worse. COVID made, I think, the situation way worse, and people always forget. You can forget the politics. I mean, we focus too much on the politics, but there are 23 million people who are really, really struggling, and when human rights is only an issue, when Yoon Suk-yeol is in power to be megaphone human rights approach, I think it's really problematic. And I'm gonna stop there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I would just jump in and say, let's not forget, it's not like the DPK has a spotless record on North Korean human rights. So I don't think you can lay that entirely at the feet of the conservatives. So.
Korea Pro, your definitive business intelligence resource for all things South Korea. Subscribe to our daily executive briefing on the most pressing issue of the day and a summary of key Korean and international news. Benefit from our analysts' original perspective on South Korea's economy, politics, security and society. The Monday Week Ahead newsletter helps you stay ahead of the curve for upcoming business and political events. Need to catch up? Our weekly podcast recaps recent developments. Trusted by leading corporations, government agencies and research institutions, Korea Pro delivers essential business intelligence daily. Stay ahead in South Korea's rapidly evolving environment. Visit koreapro.org/podcast. Korea Pro, never be sidelined again.
Speaking of which, just moving on to more general question before I open question to the floor, which will not be recorded. We do, regardless of the topics and exact arguments that you just laid out with some cases, there is definitely some sort of echo chamber sort of phenomenon that we often see. Like we see many different types of experts in DC. When topic comes up, their arguments are very, very similar. And sometimes also like Asan Planum, Chosan Ilbo Planum, whatnot, we see the same people coming in, making the same argument, and then going back and coming back a month or two later, and then talking about the different topic but same talking points, right? So why does this happen? What is like a psychological aspect of people continuing to wanting to join the club and wanting to talk about the same topic? Is it because they actually believe in the argument all the time, or is there something else than that?
So I won't pretend to speak for what's happening on the South Korean side. So why do the same DC, the same 15 DC people, get invited to everything here?
To make it an international conference, number one.
I mean, I have some ideas, but look, I mean, there's a huge problem with that. Everyone knows it. It's totally obvious. There's obviously a huge problem of manholes. Everyone knows that too. I mean, these are age-old topics here. That they were a problem when I got here 16 years ago. They're still a problem now. It's getting incrementally better, but no more than that, I will admit. So that's from the South Korean side. What happens I think in Washington, in terms of some of why you see a recycling of the ideas. We talked about some of the institutional reasons, the structural reasons, the financial reasons, and all of those I think are important. I think there's another element to this too, and this I think also brings us back to the martial law issue as well. It would be very difficult from a cognitive dissonance perspective if you were in Washington, D.C., as cynical as it is, and you were to sit there like some type of cartoon villain, twirling your mustache and putting your fingers together like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, saying, ha ha ha, I can't wait to screw over South Korean democracy, right? That's not what they're thinking, right? They think that they're on the side of the good guys. And if you've been doing this for your entire career for 30 or 35 years, over time you socialize yourself into thinking that you're on the side of the good guys, right? You're supporting, freedom, democracy, and the American way through supporting the alliance, which, especially if you were growing up in the Cold War period and you were earlier in your career in the Cold War period, that meant essentially pushing back against communism, which meant pushing back against North Korea, which meant, functionally speaking, you had no other interlocutor here except for the authoritarian right. The democratization movement comes along here, and it's complicated because the democratization movement here is partially infiltrated by North Korea, which means that there's always been a sort of stain a little bit from a conservative perspective. Who's your main interlocutor here, remember, historically? You figure out how to handle that, but you make little adjustments psychologically throughout the whole process, and you convince yourself at the end of the day still ultimately that the conservatives have changed, right? And they've become more democratic over time, and every little thing that happens with Park Geun-hye, for instance, being impeached, you find a way to excuse it, and eventually you arrive with something like what happened with Yoon Suk-yeol and the martial law declaration, and all of a sudden all of that work that you've done, that you've built up psychologically to protect yourself, seems to crumble. And all of a sudden you're like, it's like that, I don't know if you guys know the internet meme, but the one where the German guy goes, "Are we the baddies?" Right? I mean, there's this sense where all of a sudden maybe people in Washington for just a small second realize, wait a second, we were backing the wrong horse, right? Or maybe neither of the horses deserve to be supported, right? It's not like Lee Jae-myung's spotless either, right? So it's very difficult for people over the course of their career to see something happen that causes you to rethink the entire trajectory of everything that you've done, or almost everything that you've done professionally for your whole life. I mean, how many of you in this room, just try to put yourself in this position, if someone told you everything that you thought that you believed about your work was wrong, right? If you were a physicist who backed the wrong theory, right? If you were a chemist who, I don't know, supported the idea of phlogiston, or if you were a psychologist who had a completely incorrect version of the way that the mind worked, if you were a doctor who believed in humors and like all of the ancient Greek way of thinking about the physiology of the body, right? It would be really hard if someone came to you with definitive in-your-face evidence and was like, everything that you've been devoting your professional career to is wrong. And I think that's part of what we see in Washington when we see Washington not do a very good job of responding to what's happened here in South Korea, but also not just with Yoon Suk-yeol, also with Park Geun-hye, and obviously the previous times earlier during the pre-democracy era as well. So I think the psychology of people individually makes a big difference. You brought it up in a different way, talking about the language barrier, where indeed the conservatives here historically are more privileged. They spend time overseas, they speak, so of course speak better English. So of course they're also the natural interlocutors. So again, I think that there's some rational reasons and some psychological reasons for why it is that Washington sometimes gets it wrong, rather than either simply malice or not caring in some cases. I mean, I think that it's a more complex story.
Just to add a couple of anecdotes. I'm working on an article related to this, and one of the experts I spoke to, who receives money quite significantly from Korean government, said he has had phone calls after certain op-eds: delete this, we don't like it. He's being told what to say. This is I think really, really problematic stuff. And the person that told me this didn't really seem to think it was that much of an issue. And it wasn't isolated. There was another person that told me that they were told what to say in advance of a certain meeting that took place. And there's this kind of indirect funding impact and influence that I was talking about. But when you get examples like this, it's really quite egregious in my mind. And these are the people that are coming to Seoul rather. You might be meeting them to hear their analysis, to help your government understand something. And not everyone is like this, but there are some that are way too close to the funding source and too influenceable, to be honest.
Sorry, if I can just jump in real quick and be very self-deprecating for a moment. I wrote something last May. I was asked by someone with the Korea Association of International Studies, which has a website called Korea On Point, which is funded entirely by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he asked me to write something about Korea's democracy. And I wrote a piece where I hit Yoon hard and I hit Moon Jae-in hard. And to their credit, they let me publish it. Nobody said anything, which only means that I am not important enough to cancel. And so I do think that there's a level at which they will wrap your knuckles, and then there's a level at which they don't care. And I'm clearly below that level. I would also say just one other thing about the reproduction.
Sorry, can I just respond to that? Because there's a distinction we have to make here. So Korean government funding doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be doing a project that the government has a really strong interest in steering one way or another. And a good example of this is there are projects that the Korea Foundation has funded on this application-based grant process through administrations, regardless of political stripe, right? Now, the thing is, there are also presidential office funding channels into the Korea Foundation, for example, which can then be injected into the public policy community in DC. And that is funding that is coming from the president's desk. Now, that's a very different kettle of fish to the standard funded projects that are, going through the process year by year and continually being topped up. And that stuff is problematic. I mean, we have this FARA legislation in America that you're meant to register as a foreign agent if you're receiving money in exchange for sort of saying certain things publicly, which is what Sumi Terry's in trouble for. But can you tell me what the difference is with her case and you being a think tanker in DC, receiving money from the president's office through the Korea Foundation and not having to register your public policy arguments? I think it's pretty much the same thing, but the funding is just coming through different channels. So, yeah.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lane. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.